Yeah, in this video, I want to talk about a pretty common human perception. And so a pretty common perception that people have is that that they take complexity as proof of God, right? So this is the idea of a watch implying a watchmaker. And I suppose another way of phrasing the title of the video would be that a watch does imply a watchmaker, and that something complex requires a creator. So in this sense, complexity is taken as proof of God. I think this is a very understandable judgment, and I don't think that it's necessarily invalid on its face. But this plays back into the concept of the God of the gaps, where we have gaps in our knowledge and we can't understand something that's extremely complex, and so we assume that because we can't understand this complex thing, phenomenon, or object, then that's proof of some sort of watchmaker or some sort of higher power. You look at things as complex as the development of language and how complex language. I mean, when you think about the process by which different word usages and different language norms catch on, that takes a great deal of time. How certain terms for things catch on in a widespread sense, why we use certain terms for certain things, and why those things catch on is a very complex process. You look at things like a self-replicating cell, or the human eye, or humans themselves, or planets, or star systems and galaxies. We take all of that as, oh, that's astoundingly complex. That's a very complex watch, or it's at least likened to that. And based on that complexity, we make the judgment that there is some sort of higher power or some sort of creator, a conscious intelligence behind that. Now, interestingly, I don't think that complexity, something no matter how complex, does not prove that it was created intentionally, and complexity is not proof of God. We have to remember that complexity is the perception that something is complex is an entirely subjective human perception. It's simply that our brains perceive it as complex. The complexity may not actually, the human eye, the universe, the structure of the universe itself, the development of language, all of these things are complex. But given sufficient time, any one of these extremely complex phenomena or objects could develop given enough time, and infinite levels of complexity are possible in an infinite universe, both in space and time. So the idea that because something is complex, that implies the existence of a conscious intelligence as a creator is not a good assumption or a conclusion. We perceive that something is complex. That doesn't mean that it truly is. If something is truly, just because it's difficult for us to understand, we then label it complex. That does not mean that it was created consciously or intelligently. The watch does not imply, and to liken these things to, the watch does not imply a watchmaker, and complexity does not imply God or a higher power in any way, depending on how you define these terms. And complexity ends up being whether something is complex is entirely a subjective human perception. They may not actually be complex. That's simply a label we apply to something we don't understand very easily. So any one of these things, given sufficient time and evolution through natural selection, and in terms of the formation of things other than life forms in the universe, Yes, any one of these things we could call complex, but that's all that we can say is that they're complex. We can't say that they're created. Um, so it's ultimately a very bad conclusion that uh, something complex, uh, well, even is complex, and it's that's entirely subjective. That's a human perception rather than a fact about reality. As I said, we label things complex that are difficult for us to grasp or understand readily. Now, if yeah, and so right, I mean, um, there are certain things that right. So I mean, it's how we define complexity, and whether something really truly meets the whether a complexity is an objective fact or just a subjective human perception about things. Um, Goes back to the God of the gaps fallacy, to the what I would just call the watchmaker fallacy. All of these things are ways that humans, um, you know, perceive the universe rather than facts about the universe. So we have to distinguish between what is a fact and what merely seems to be the case from our perspective. And so something being the fact that we feel that something is complex does not mean that it truly is. And that label does not then, it's not necessarily a fact, it's simply a perspective or a perception complexity. I mean, the perception that something is complex. So ultimately, this does not give one license to then assume a creator. And it's often complexity, the perception that something is complex, is taken as a fact about it being complex in an objective reality sense. So basically, but a lot of people fall into this trap of thinking it's like, wow, this thing is magically complex. There must be a creator behind it. Is not a good way of thinking, and it's not unnecessary in any way. If we then assume that complexity, the perception that something is complex, is simply a subjective human perception rather than a fact. So complexity does not imply a creator. Um, the fact that something arouses a feeling of awe and something seems special in that way does not then give us license to make any assumptions about where that thing came from, and what it is. So that's really the only point that I'm trying to make here, is that complexity does not imply that the complexity of a phenomenon or an object does not then imply that there was something, uh, that it was, doesn't imply a higher power. But many people take complexity as a license to then believe, um, right, to believe that it was created, that the watch implies the watchmaker. Now, I've talked about this and touched upon it briefly in a previous live stream where, um, you know, given sufficient time through the mechanism of natural selection and evolution, um, and given enough time, anything could develop at even infinite levels of complexity. And it's the thing is I mean, something merely being complex to us does not then make it so. It's a perception rather than a fact. It isn't even really understandable. It's simply that we haven't applied a rigorous. We people end up not being sufficiently rigorous when thinking about these things. Um, and yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours about why it's understandable. That doesn't necessarily make it true simply because it's understandable or right. And so yeah, and the idea of the God of the gaps is that there are things that we don't understand absolutely, but the fact that we don't understand it doesn't mean that it's the fact that it's beyond our comprehension does not then imply that the thing that we're perceiving complex as complex was the product of a conscious, intelligent force that created it and preconceived it and everything else. It's yeah, it's unfortunate that we can't distinguish, that we can't that most people can't distinguish between. Maybe they can distinguish, they just either choose not to, or it hasn't occurred to them. So I have this idea of a framework that I've sort of developed regarding human thought as, so to me, this only vaguely relates to the topic of the video that I've set as the title. But it's the distinction between suggestibility versus prompting. So some people have a great deal of suggestibility. They don't need to be prompted to then understand or perceive something. But in my view, anyone could understand or perceive something with enough prompting. So it's, in my view, anyone can perceive or understand anything. It's simply that only some people happen to be suggestible enough that it would occur to them without prompting. The concept or the idea would occur to them without prompting. But with enough prompting, anyone would be able to perceive or understand anything. So, but yeah, the idea that complexity, perceiving that something is complex, is not then a license to assume that there was a conscious intelligence or a creator behind it. So I don't know. This will probably be a short stream because that's really the only point that I wanted to make. But I'll keep the stream going for a couple more minutes if there are any relevant questions, and then I'll just end it having already made my main point. And I will touch upon the idea of suggestibility versus prompting in the next stream.